Welcome to the GameDev.tv Community Podcast. I'm your host KB, and I would like to introduce you to industry professionals and people who successfully made their path to the video game industry. I hope that you will enjoy the podcast and get useful tips that will bring you closer to achieving your dreams. Now, let's get right into the podcast. So welcome to the GameDev.tv podcast, John. We're happy to have you here. I'm KB from LA.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we got Ricardo from Poland. And we're here to talk about game development, your learning journey, and everything else that you've been up to. So you are a CEO of a company, and you've made a bunch of critically acclaimed games like Star Trek and Game of Thrones. And can you also let the fans know a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll go from there?
Sure. I guess my life story with respect to games starts back in high school. I wrote a couple of games for early bulletin board systems, kind of almost pre-internet. Then I went off to college. And when I was 19, met my future wife in an online game. And we were playing a game together, and we figured we could build a better game than the one we were playing. So I dropped out of college. She moved across the country, and we started a game company together. So that was a game called Legends of Future Past, text-based role-playing game. After that, I did some stuff that wasn't specifically games or outside of games. I started a software company that built what you'd call today blog and wiki software, so content management systems to help businesses get on the internet. Started a company called Gamer DNA, where we built a recommendation engine based on the way you play games, built an ad network around it, and then got back into making games again with a company called Disruptor Beam. So started a company called Disruptor Beam. The idea of the company was to make games that were really story-based, but do it within a platform that hadn't been really well known for stories, so which is social networks, mobile devices. So at the time, most of the games being made were puzzle-based games or kind of simple clicker type games. And I felt that there was an opportunity to bring people into a more story-based experience where there were characters and you were immersed into a world. So that's really the only idea we had when we started Disruptor Beam. Again, started that company with my wife again, so we did it multiple times.
A dynamic duo. I love it.
Yeah. Very quickly into that, realized that the dynamics of social networks, mobile devices, you have a very limited amount of time before someone decides that they're going to play the game. So you have to really capture their attention quickly. So that actually makes storytelling really, really hard in that environment, because so much about storytelling is about, giving that player an opportunity to get to know the world, get to know the story, start to really enjoy it on that level. Now, if you sell a AAA game on a console or a PC, people have, hours to figure that out. They just spent $60 plus, so they're going to stick with it a little bit longer than a mobile game where maybe they're only in it for 30 seconds before they decide if they're going to keep playing. So it occurred to me that we had to solve for that problem if we wanted to do the kind of story-based games we wanted. And that led us down the path of doing licenses. So the first one that we built, you mentioned it already, was Game of Thrones. So I actually kind of just stalked George R. R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, for a while. It took me like a year even to get a meeting with him. Eventually, I think his agent just figured that he had to put me in front of him for a half hour or he'd never get rid of me or something. But
that's hilarious.
The whole got in front of George. Got in front of George, and George ended up wanting to talk about it for hours. He's super smart, doesn't really use what you'd consider to be a current computer. He was writing Game of Thrones in WordStar.
What's WordStar? I'm too
old. WordStar's a word processor from a long time ago, over 20 years ago. It was WordStar on a circa 1997 PC.
What? That's why it takes a while sometimes to write the books, but that's crazy.
Yeah, but he loved it. But despite that, it makes him sound like a Luddite, which maybe is slightly accurate, but he totally gets technology. He understands how people use it. He could understand how people could have this social experience in the world that he set up. So he loved the idea, and I really got what he was trying to accomplish with Game of Thrones. And we connected, and before long, we got a deal done with him, as well as then HBO, who produced the TV show. At the time I got the deal done, they hadn't even come out with the show yet, so nobody even knew whether it would be popular or not. But we took. I would have done it even without the TV show, because I had read the books and I really loved the world that he had crafted. But of course, with HBO having made the show, it ended up bringing so many more people into the audience. So we ended up having 11 million people play that game. Ran for about 6 years. Wow. So super happy with the kind of gameplay we created. Still in touch with so many players that game had a big impact in their life. I met my wife in an online game. Well, I've learned that many people ended up getting married or making lifelong friendships from the Game of Thrones game that we made, which was called Game of Thrones Ascent. But then, based on that track record with that game, it led us to do a Star Trek game, a Walking Dead game, and then the last game that we shipped was based on Archer, the FX series. So built a whole bunch of games with storytelling elements in them, all based on popular television shows.
That's a huge list of accomplishments, but that's amazing. And I actually want to get started with how you even got to doing games. Like, what was it? Something you were younger and you just loved playing games? Or was it a little bit later down the line? When did you start getting into games?
Wow. If you want to go way back, I'd say there were two parallel themes in my early childhood development, I guess. I always loved computers. Right. So my dad worked at a company called Digital Equipment Corp, which was one of the early mini computer companies, even mainframe companies. He would take me into the computer lab on the weekends. I was like 7 years old at this time, and he'd plop me down in front of terminals connected to these mainframe computers. And this was completely, there was no video games. It was all text, but I just loved computers. Wanted to understand everything about them, started learning to program. Video games came out. I enjoyed video games too, of course, but it sort of started there. Parallel to that, loved games. Dungeons and Dragons was sort of my early game playing before, obviously not on computers, but just, played Dungeons and Dragons, got really into it, loved being a dungeon master, the creativity of making adventures for people. So those were kind of the parallel themes. And then, got lucky enough that I was able to bring those two separate loves together in the form of making games.
I love that. And then, so what did you decide to do for games? Was it like programming, making a studio? What was like your thing when you were first starting out?
Well, when I got started, you could make a game by yourself. So I was very lucky that, that's when I got in the, not that it doesn't happen today. Like you get games like Undertale where literally one guy did absolutely every element of it, but that's pretty rare these days. I was able to code games on my own. The first game I made was one called Space Empire, which was a multiplayer game about conquering the galaxy, developing planets, forming alliances with other players. So multiplayer strategy game, but really about the politics, because the game was kind of easy to win if you made the right alliances with other players who were consistent players. So that was my early gameplay that I got involved in.
Awesome. And so you started Beamable, right? Can you go a little bit into what that is?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So, after building games for years at Disruptor Beam, I just really came to realize that we had learned a ton of stuff about how to make games, how to get them out, but how to bring live operations in it, monetize your game, bring social elements into the game, create the content management and the authoring pipeline so that you could keep a game updated all the time. Going back to Game of Thrones Ascent, one of the really unique aspects of that game is every single week we'd have new content in the game. And when the show was on the air, like the show would come out on a Sunday. By the next day, content from that show would be in the game. So if you saw items in the game or characters in the game, storylines from that episode, it would actually be in the game the next day. So we had to get very good at making an authoring pipeline that could allow you to update content very rapidly. So we had learned all this stuff, and I love making games. But I realized that it would be selfish for me to keep all of that to myself when I could bring that capability to the whole world of game developers out there. Because I think one of the problems in game development is building that live operations infrastructure and bringing best practices to it has gotten so expensive that it's gotten to the point where actually making a game, you spend more of your time capital on that stuff than the actual fun part of either making a game or playing a game. And I just thought that was kind of a crime, right? Like that's actually not what the game business should be about. And I felt that if I could solve that for people, the benefit is they'd have a lot more shots on goal. They could actually build more games. The games that they build, they'd be able to iterate more quickly. They'd be able to try new features, because I think that's what the game business is all about. We got very lucky at Disruptor Beam, by the way. Like the first game we made did pretty well, right? It was in a day when you could ship on the app stores and get featured by Apple and you'd have millions of installs. So we got lucky. It's really hard to reproduce just based on luck. So what I really felt game developers needed to do was be able to try more things and really get games great so that when they ship them, they would have the greatest chance of capturing an audience, delighting players. And that means letting game developers just focus on what they want to do anyway, which is make fun games, do storytelling, create art, create really engaging features, right? Everything else is a distraction from that. And I hate to see game developers or game studios spending all of their time and energy like reinventing the wheel or building the stuff which you really can't even reinvent at this point. Like these systems have gotten so complex, it's really hard to play that catch up. So that was what I experienced at Disruptor Beam that gave the idea to Beamable. So what I did then is I decided that we would pivot the company from making games and instead take the technology that we had invented and the team that had invented it and essentially reboot the company, create a new business, which is now called Beamable. And we create software. We fight for the game makers. It's our slogan at the company. And it's all about enabling game developers to focus on what they really want. And we can provide them with the server infrastructure, the live services, all the stuff that'll actually allow you to turn it into a business. And Beamable has the live services to let you do things like social features or monetize your game through IPs and set up shops. It lets you do the content management workflows like I talked about earlier that we kind of learned in Game of Thrones and then later Star Trek, so you can keep your game up to date all the time. But what's really made the platform powerful is we discovered that we could create this architecture that lets a Unity developer code all of that server authoritative logic in C# without ever having DevOps, without going to a separate IDE or code stack environment. Just keep it all self-contained within one code package using C#. And we make it just super easy to do that. Like you can add multiplayer or server authoritative logic to your game. Like in the afternoon, you install our platform. So our hope then is that millions of people are going to be able to build live games with the simplicity that, say, a Roblox developer has right now. Like in Roblox, you can build a game very easily that has live components and multiplayer components because of how integrated that server stack is, and the fact that the client and the server code are packaged together, that you don't have to think about server operations and whatnot. So really our vision for the company is make game development that easy, but for people that really want to own their own destiny and have the freedom to build their game, deliver it however they want. You don't have to live in a walled garden. You actually really control your own game thus control your own destiny. So that's the future we see. And I just am just excited about the idea of unlocking all this creativity out there in the world, because I think that there's so many great games to be made if we can just make it a lot easier and help people be in smaller teams.
No, I agree 100%. That's genius, the idea you have, because it just allows everyone to then just focus on making the game instead of saying, what if I have to do this? Or then, like, when you do finish the game, you're like, well, then where do I go from now? And then you see a bunch of games just end up lost or actually never get pushed out. And so I also wanted to ask, was starting this business like kind of scary, going from like maybe a game development company to more like a SaaS company? Or did you try to do it at the same time and it didn't work out?
Well, I think you always have to be optimistic to be an entrepreneur, and I'm an optimist. So I wouldn't say it's scary. I was more afraid of, what if I don't do it? Okay. Like, what will that mean? Because I would regret not really taking a stab at this idea, because I saw a bunch of other people who had tried sort of aspects of the problem, and in my opinion, they had all got it wrong. There's a bunch of, you know, GitHub projects and software projects and what they call back-end as a service companies out there, and they had built some of the components. The problem with it is all that they did is they moved some of the effort away from coding those services to now it's a systems integration project with those services. And I think our epiphany as a company, as a team, was you can't just solve it at the component level. You actually have to solve the architecture problem. The architecture problem is the issue of the multiplication of languages, brittle processes, separate code stacks for client versus server. Like, all of that complexity that it introduces radically increases team size and consequently slows down team velocity and iteration and shots on goal. So that's, I think, our different approach to it. And I just felt obsessed with that. If we didn't solve that problem, like, we're doing a disservice actually to the game development world, because we seem to be the only one who actually noticed that you could solve this as an architecture problem, as opposed to just making a new set of components for like IAPs or a component for friend lists or something. Like, that stuff's valuable, but it's not super valuable. If we could only change the way development processes work, then a small team could actually build a huge game with really interesting and robust social functionality, free-to-play mechanics, if that's what you want to have, regular updates, all of that stuff, and control their own destiny, have the ability to modify it, change some of the logic in a way that suits your particular game, rather than always have to come back to us for, say, new server modules that only we can do for you.
I'm curious, how do you get to the point where you have Beamable? Like, so did you build this process beforehand with the, like, Star Trek and Game of Thrones, and then saw how good it was, and then basically deconstructed it and said, how can we make this into a product that people can use, like a service that they can use?
Well, we had always invested in what we were calling the platform at Disruptor Beam, with the idea that it could be reused across many of our projects of our own. And I think in the back of our minds, we thought maybe other people could license the platform from us and use it. So we were building it with an eye towards reuse and scalability and multi-tenanted architecture and the security structure to allow that to happen, even from the early days. And we spent a lot on it. We spent millions of dollars, developing that. And I lost the original. What was the original question? Sorry.
Oh, no, it's good. So I was basically just saying how to get, like, let's say somebody wanted to take their, let's say they built a, not a plugin, but like a system that works for them in their game, like you did with the integration of building live games. And then how do you take that and then make it into a service that you can sell? Like, what's the process of turning this into a business for someone who like wanted to start their own
so
thing?
That's a great question. Thanks for clarifying it. So the First of all, I think a lot of game studios have built a technology and they look at it and they say other game studios ought to be able to use this. I think what's often underestimated is the gap from something that works for yourself as a internal tool and then turning that into something that's fully productized. So the gap includes a lot of stuff. So first of all, really making it self-service so that someone can just download it and it's activated and it's easy to get online and usable. Easier said than done, right? So our product is built around a combination of a plugin that you can install for Unity and then a SAAS architecture, which is automatically instantiated in response to the plugin being installed in your Unity environment, like standing up all the server backend and all the stuff that actually makes that work in a scalable way without requiring, say, our engineers to get involved. Like that's super complicated for this kind of thing. Now, some of the tools that you're talking about, maybe they don't have that level of complexity because they're not like a server system, for example. But you still then have to think about, well, how do we make it easy for people to understand? How do you document it? How do you package it? Like all of that work is at least as big, if not bigger, than the core problem that the technology solves. And that's what's very frequently underestimated. And I think you can see how that played out, say, in the 3D engine market in gaming. So like Unity, for example, started, as I understand it, in a similar way. Like they were working on games and then they realized they created this graphics pipeline, which is really awesome and a lot of other people should benefit from it. But it took them a lot to go from some tools that worked for them to something that actually scaled out across a whole market. It took many years, in fact. And then on top of that, they had to invest heavily in education and tutorials and documentation and onboarding, all of that stuff that actually allowed the market to embrace it. So that worked for them. And I think that that's still missing from this whole realm of like the back end, the server, the multiplayer architecture that sits within so many games today is still sort of like, it's 10 years old for the most part. It's like when people were doing DirectX programming years ago before there were real 3D engines that gave you the interoperability and the physics and the lighting systems and the Visual Studio environment and the integrated script languages, all that stuff that's made stuff like Unity and of course Unreal as well works so well. You know, we're still kind of in that era with respect to everything that sits below the level of the graphic environment of the game. So yeah, it's really hard to package products and make them work. Now, I was a little bit different than a lot of other people who had run game studios. I had also built an enterprise software company. So I built this software company that built blog and wiki content management software for the web. So I was very well acquainted with creating, in that case, enterprise software. It was not exactly SaaS. It was more of an enterprise software product, but still understood like how do you really package a product for an industry as opposed to a tool set for consultants to then kind of retrofit into different environments. And I had built essentially an ad network for the game industry as well. So I was able to see through these different lenses of the game industry, how to create enterprise software. I worked on the demand gen side of the game business. So that knowledge, that experience had told me how hard it is to actually build products like that and go from a tool set to industry-wide solutions. So we took it seriously is the bottom line. Like we put the right kind of people on it with a combination of game dev experience, but also how to create super scalable environments and stuff that require documentation and all that stuff. We just took it really seriously from day one because that's what you have to do if you want to create either a dev tools business or a SaaS product that's going to scale out.
No, yeah, it sounds like it's going to be a very complicated process, and if you don't get it right, could end up spending a lot of money and time on something that won't be successful. So also you're an entrepreneur. So I wanted to ask, what is it like starting these companies, and what is the process to make sure that they become successful? As in, like, let's also, can you give it in a way that's also helpful for people who want to start their own like game studio?
Sure. So I've started a few businesses. Some of them have been successful, some of them haven't. So, I think that is the entrepreneur's journey, is trying a lot of stuff, and some stuff isn't going to work. It's a fairly rare exception to see someone just hit it out of the park every single time. And often it's not the first or second time. So I would just say you got to have a lot of perseverance. You have to be willing to just really work at it, and you certainly can't be afraid of failure, and you have to be willing to learn from the mistakes along the way and incorporate it back into how you think about stuff. So being an entrepreneur is one of the hardest things to do. It's certainly the hardest thing I know how to do. That I imagine there's even harder things out there. But for me, it's the hardest thing I know how to do. I love doing it. For me, you got to just really love problem solving, and you have to really love people as well, because companies are not just a technology idea or a business solution. Like, entrepreneurship is all about harnessing the power of organizations and people to take an innovative idea, capitalize it, and build a real machine around the idea. And that's the other aspect. So if you love problem solving and you really like organizations and building teams, then you'll be well equipped to build any business, including a game studio, because game studios are a little bit different in that I think it's sometimes a little weird to talk about game studios as like solving a problem in the same way like a lot of other businesses do. But of course they are. They're filling people's lives with joy and entertainment, which is something we all need. Maybe it's sometimes undervalued by certain people, but like this is something that's part of the human experience, is experiencing stories and art and interacting with other people. So I feel like game developers and anybody building the metaverse, they're doing some of the most important work that exists in our society, because it's bring joy to life, right? So I think the problem solving aspect really comes about aligning an understanding of a market that you're really excited about, more specifically, not just a market, the people, the audience in that market that really care about a particular kind of experience or gameplay, and knowing that you understand it super well and you can deliver an experience for them, and also understanding what it will take to build that experience, the kind of team that will be required, the type of capital that may be required to actually give that team enough time, runway, and shots on goal to successfully execute. So yeah, I mean, love teams, because you're going to need to build a team to be any kind of entrepreneur. And game studios, I mean, creative leadership is also one of the hardest things that exists. Just getting these super creative people working together towards an alignment of vision and staying on the same page through the course of a project that can take often a lot longer than you were expecting.
Usually a lot longer.
Yeah.
No, but you mentioned creative leadership. How would you define creative leadership? As in being like a leader who finds solutions like creatively, or is it something more complex?
I mean, at a high level, I just think of creative leadership as I'm specifically referring to the leadership that's required to ship a creative product.
I got you.
Right. So, what's challenging about creative products is there's often so much fog of war or surrounding you at all times, in that if you're solving a very specific business problem, you have to add efficiency to a process or something. Like, it's a little more directly measurable, and you can iterate, and it fits into agile development processes, and it's still super hard. Like, by the way, this is always really, really hard. That's hard enough, okay? But then when you're talking about a creative product, it's not always obvious when you're deep into that you're actually making something fun, or that there's a coherence in the artistry, the storytelling, the user interface, all the things that have to come together to make a game really work. So I believe that, and there's a lot of ways to, there's a lot of different teams, and there's a lot of different team leaders, but in my own personal experience, it's important to have someone on that team who can really carry the vision of the game, including through its darkest hours, right? So every software product, by the way, has some pretty dark hours in which you just look at it some days and you're like, are we doing anything important here? But with games in particular, like, there's going to be stages in that game where it doesn't hang together. There's big gaps. It's hard to know precisely if you're working towards something that's going to be good or not. Now,
how long do those dark times usually last? Okay, it varies.
It
could
can
be
last a long time. I mean, when we built Star Trek Timelines, the game was built over a 2-year period. I'd say the first year of it was just us trying a lot of things. We tried about 5 different game designs, and we threw out 4 of them completely along the way, retained very little from those early designs to the 5th design, which we then felt excited about. And then, but even within that, like, there was a lot of things that didn't make it into the final product for good reason. Some people weren't happy, for example, that their piece didn't make it into the final product. I actually think that's a good thing in games. Like, the goal of the creative leader of a game isn't to make sure that everything that had ever been crafted ends up in the final product. It's that what does end up is part of a coherent product that delivers fun to a particular kind of audience. How do you do that? Customer feedback. So I feel like really early, it's hard to get customer feedback. You're kind of your own customer in the very early days of a product. But as soon as you can start showing what you're working on to people who are in that audience that you think is going to be excited about your game, start getting the feedback. I think that's one of the mistakes that game studios frequently make, is not getting market feedback early and frequently enough in the course of development. Now, if you're too early, you probably won't get any useful feedback, but that's okay. Like, who cares? So you got some early feedback that wasn't that useful to you, so because it was too early. I mean, I guess there's teams that want to keep it super secret for whatever reason, but on balance, my experience is the earliest that you can start actually getting useful feedback about gameplay or any aspect. Maybe it's just feedback on the storytelling of the game.
Yeah,
the
or
better.
the idea.
Now with Star Trek Timelines, we did that. I mean, we would show just sort of like high-level concepts to people early in the process, started to get some feedback. We actually went to Penny Arcade Expo and had a booth.
Wow.
About, I forget how many months, 8 months before we ultimately shipped the product, 10 months before we ultimately shipped the product. And we showed up there to promote. There was a marketing aspect of the booth to just let people know that we were working on it. But we weren't really at Penny Arcade Expo at this huge booth just to market it, because it's actually kind of hard to make the economics work out on these trade shows, particularly with a free-to-play game like this. What we were actually there for was to get people in front of the game and get customer feedback. And it was a huge win for that, because we got through Penny Arcade Expo with 1,000 gameplay sessions logged on our servers, where we got to see what people were doing, where they got bored and walked away, what people seemed to enjoy. And then we'd actually even interview people and get some feedback on how they enjoyed the game session. So it gave us a lot of insight. Actually, on the second day of Penny Arcade Expo, we actually shipped a slightly different build of the game based on what we had learned on the first day. So we were able to iterate that quickly that by the next day there were some relevant changes in it. And then we were able to see whether that was sort of capturing more of the metrics and engagement that we wanted. But we learned really important things about what were people getting confused about, what was engaging them. And we came away from that saying, hey, there's some really, we came away with the feeling that at a high level, we were really capturing the essence of Star Trek, and players liked it. They liked the story. They liked it conceptually, but there were important parts of the execution that the player wasn't super happy with or just confused about. So we had to go back to the drawing board on some aspects of the gameplay and just keep iterating it from there. And it was totally worth it because the game, is still being played by millions of people 5 years later, and people really love the game that we created. And I think if we hadn't made that investment in getting market feedback early enough, we just wouldn't have made as good of a game. And the mistakes I've made are when we haven't gotten that feedback or we've taken it to market too quickly. So I will tell every game studio, every game developer out there, the way you really are going to de-risk your game development is market feedback, cut the expenses and costs that either slow you down or don't add directly to the fun factor of the game. Cancel the computer science projects, focus on the gameplay, make it super fun, get people to tell you if they like it, if you can actually instrument it, record sessions, all that stuff is so incredibly valuable. And be willing to move on to new designs if those first designs aren't working. Now that's where the person who is ultimately responsible for shipping the game, the creative leader of that game, has to be able to look at it and say, is this fulfilling the vision of the game? If not, am I willing to try something else? And I think it can be very powerful in a good way to try something else. And good teams should actually rally around that. Yes, we are bold enough to say this hasn't been quite enough in this gameplay. We're going to try to raise the bar and get another iteration, import what we learned, but make it that much better. And if you can give yourself that runway, it's incredibly powerful. That comes back to my core thesis with Beamable, which is how can we just give people that runway? The way we can give them that runway is let them focus on creativity, all this complexity of the architecture, multiple languages, live services components, all that stuff that's important to make a commercially successful game these days. Don't get sunk into that prematurely. Be able to optimize around a small team, a tightly knit team with strong creative leadership so you can just execute with all the time that you've got and give yourself extra time as well.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say would be a proper way to turn criticism into improvements to the game? Especially generic criticisms, things like, oh, I don't like this.
Well, I would always listen, right? But I think you do have to pay attention to who is giving you the feedback and whether they're who you would consider to be part of the relevant market for the game, right? So if you show any game to a random sample of humans, you're going to get, I will say almost any game will have someone who loves it, right? You'd be surprised, maybe not surprised, but almost any game you can identify this hardcore population of people who just love what those designers are trying to accomplish, even if it isn't mass market successful. You're certainly going to get a lot of people who don't love it. Now in free-to-play games, by the way, free-to-play games, you're super lucky if you can get 5% of your audience to convert to paying. So right away, like that means 95% of your audience doesn't like it enough to produce any revenue for that game. So
That's wild.
like, so I think, first of all, don't take that the wrong way. First of all, many of those players could still be engaged with the game. They'll be part of the community of the game. That's actually super valuable in a free-to-play game, to have that community, and because they end up becoming part of the story, the content, the experience of that game. So you want that. That said, they're just not willing to pay for it. Not with dollars. They'll pay for it with their attention. With games, you just got to look at like, who is that audience that's going to be willing to pay, and are you satisfying what they want out of it, right? Like if I show a first-person shooter game to everybody,
Candy Crush player.
well, a Candy Crush player may or may not like it, but if I show it to the general population, most people don't want to play a first-person shooter game, right? Like you could probably say that about virtually any game. Like pick a game type, most people don't want to play that game. You know, even super popular games, Animal Crossing or something, which I don't know,
I've never played.
Okay, so maybe if we showed you Animal Crossing, you'd be like, oh, this isn't for me. But 60 million people, maybe probably a lot more actually at this point, 60 million plus installs, think it's awesome. Like it's the thing that saved them in the pandemic and gave them a place that they could sort of, gel out, have fun, be relaxed, escape from everything that's going on. The point is, any game type, the majority of people won't like it, right? So that's why one of the first things I said is, I think you got to start at any game concept or game studio with an audience that you really feel you understand, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be yourself. Like I don't actually think it's required to only build games for yourself. In some ways, that can be, sometimes that produces great games. Sometimes you create a game for an audience of one or a very small niche market. It's more important, I think, to just declare who you think your audience is, have a realistic sense of how big that market is, how big that audience is, because that'll help inform how much capital that product might deserve to build it, how you'd market it, a lot of really important things that'll make that game concept viable or not. But really, at a fundamental level, understand what's going on in the heads of the players who love this kind of game or love this kind of experience that you can bring them, because you've got to have amazing empathy with these customers to be able to build a game that's going to resonate. There's way too many games out there that are just clones of something else where, listen, sometimes fast follow games do work. I won't say it doesn't. There's plenty of evidence that it does. But what happens the vast majority of the time is you're looking at the surface of the game and you're not really understanding how those decisions were made, what kind of social structure emerges around that game, what really drives the motivations underneath all of that. And when you just clone the surface, you're not understanding how you then prioritize according to what that audience is really, really going to care about. So start with the audience and understanding them. And that's also why I said get to know your audience by showing them the game and getting their feedback and involving them in the development process as much as you can. I'm a big believer in building communities, communicating with people, really involving them. I think that produces much better games.
I think it's a good question.
I think with today's culture of like remasters and remakes as well, you get this idea of like, why did something work? Why did people buy into that? Gets kind of lost, and people just make the same game kind of again, and then, or movie, especially movies. And you end up with a product nobody wanted, right?
Yeah, although more often than not, though, the mistake that's made by the sequel is not understanding the magic of the first one that people liked. So a lot of the time when I come back to a sequel, I want to actually, in many ways, just do the same stuff to me that you did the first time, right? Like maybe not the exact same plot, like down to the same sequence, but I want to have the same experiences, the same kind of emotional resonance with me. I want to do similar things. Like if I'm playing, like let's talk about a long-running franchise like Civilization. Like if I played Civilization, the next version of Civilization, if it was a first-person shooter, like I like first-person shooters, I play them personally. But if it morphed into that, I'd be like, what the heck? That's not what I was expecting from this. I wanted to like build up a city, develop a tech tree, have that feeling of just one more move, hard to pull myself away. Like that's
it is.
Civilization, right? So I wouldn't ever say to someone like, hey, you're making the next version of something and it kind of just did the same thing before. That's actually good. Like that's what the player wants. That's why I say know your audience, know what they're wanting. Like if they want a particular set of things, it's totally core to that experience. You want to give it to them. You don't want, because a lot of the mistakes made in games is like when the game developers get a little too clever and they thought that they could pivot to say from one game to a much bigger audience or something like that, and they start changing some of the fundamental rules of the game and the experience in a hope that they could radically expand it. Often, sometimes it works. Like, listen, it's games. Like you will find everything that I've said in this conversation that has been based on whatever wisdom I've captured. Like you'll find a counterexample. You'll find a really great counterexample to it. But generally speaking, it just comes down to knowing your audience again and what they really care about, and then giving it to them so that they can have that emotional experience and they can recreate that emotion that they experienced in a prior game. I think that's great when you can do that.
What I was going to ask earlier is the big question is, where do you find your audience online? Is it because you don't want to just go somewhere and be like, oh, these are just trolls who just for some reason are watching this and hating on it? But where are the actual fans who actually care and actually give criticism or advice? Do you have like a forum, or do you think it's just maybe like certain videos on YouTube?
It's going to be completely audience specific, but if it's an audience that you feel you understand on some level, I suspect you know where to go to find where that audience is hanging out, whether it's a Reddit or a Facebook group or a Discord server or wherever it is. You're probably either already a member of those communities in one way or another, or maybe you're not in the community, you're kind of interested in it. The communities are there. You'll find them. It doesn't take that much effort these days to find your way in there. You don't have to find a million people. I think people often fall into these traps around like scaling and stuff prematurely. Like early on, you don't need a million people. You don't need 1,000 people. Like I think lots and lots of great products begin with the feedback of, say, dozens to 100, parts of that members of that community. So find an audience. I mean, I wouldn't say one isn't enough. You want more people than you can count on your fingers, right? Like you don't want to have such a small group that it's heavily biased to someone's niche interest. But you start to get even to dozens of people in the audience. You'll start to see the themes of what people care about. You get 100, you're going to see the themes. Now, in the very earliest stages of a game, that's going to be enough. You're not going to go from that to then release a game purely on the feedback of that group. Most likely, at some point, you're going to want to scale up into larger test audiences, which is, if you can find 100 people that like your game concept, you can find 1,000 people, right? Like that takes a little bit of legwork, but it's actually not that hard to do. First of all, that 100 people, probably a bunch of their friends are in the next several hundred that you're going to get. So you don't have to go crazy like doing marketing programs. I would say this is much more about a hands-on, live in the community, befriend people genuinely who share the same interests, get to know them, hear some different points of view. Other people may like things that you don't personally like. That's important for understanding audiences. It's not, that's one of the hard things as a game designer, is realizing that you're building for an audience. You're not just building for yourself, right?
That's key. I think most people don't understand that. It's like you're building something that you want a lot of people to enjoy. So even though you might like it, you got to make sure that your audience is going to enjoy it at the same time.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the fact that a lot of people come into game development because they want to build this specific game that they wanted to play and never got to, right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of survivorship bias in the game industry as well, to be clear, right? So a certain amount of the time you build a game for yourself that you just felt compelled to build, and it just so happened that a lot of other people also really love that same thing, and you built the right thing, and then it works. Millions of people play it. Maybe you make some money, and then people point to it and they're like,
"See, I can do that too."
That's how you do that. So. That said, I would always say, like, if you're super passionate about a game concept and you feel in your heart that this is a game idea that enough people in the world are really going to love, and you just need to make it and follow through on it, then do it. Like, that's part of being an entrepreneur as well. I think everyone who starts a game studio is an entrepreneur, obviously. So, sometimes great ideas don't have a lot of proof or obvious audiences out there in the market. I'll say it can be a tough road to do that. It might be harder to find your audience. You might face a lot of challenges. But I don't know. Did the guy who made Stardew Valley, did he really care about that? No, he spent 5 years or whatever making this game that a lot of people really liked, and for one person making that game over a period of time, he ended up super enjoying the fruits of that labor investment that he made, because he really felt like it was a kind of game that people would enjoy, and he was right. He stuck with it. And there's other examples of that too.
For when you're making a game like Game of Thrones or Star Trek, what's it like taking the IP and then making a game out of it? Like, in my opinion, feel like it would be very hard to really capture the same thing that they did and then do it in your own, and then to understand the history, the lore, and everything all at once. Like, I feel like you have to spend so much time researching just to make sure you get everything right, because I know people can get very nitpicky about certain things. It's like, oh, this doesn't fit exactly how the books did it, and this and that, and even coming up with new stories from a vision that wasn't even originally yours. So how do you do that, and how did you make like Star Trek timelines and Game of Thrones Ascent?
Well, I think that it starts with a respect for the source material and a respect for the audience, and just realizing that you are entering someone else's world and hopefully adding to it. But it's not like you're gonna. The biggest mistake you could make is, hey, this world's popular, I'm just gonna kind of put my own stamp on it and channel people out of that experience into my own very discontinuous experience. So what does that mean? I think you've got to triangulate around a deep understanding of what the creators of that world really intended what they, because if it was important to them, they brought it into the storytelling and the characters and the themes, right? So you can't skip that. You really have to understand that. But also, you have to couple that with what does the audience understand of it, right? So Star Trek, by the way, is a super challenging franchise for a lot of reasons. One is, it's science fiction, but unlike a lot of science fiction, which is very propelled by like the combat and the fighting, Star Trek has fighting in it, and it's important when it happens in Star Trek, but actually the majority of plot and character development in Star Trek doesn't revolve around just fighting scenes. Like, a lot of it depends on ethics, philosophy, technology, like all that stuff. So, we, I think, had an appreciation for that, and we set out with Star Trek to take on a really huge challenge, which was, don't just make a combat sim in the Star Trek universe. Now, there are good combat sims in the Star Trek universe. There are games where you can play a starship captain and fight Klingons and fire photon torpedoes, and some of them are pretty good. But we felt, to make a game that truly captures Star Trek and would really get the audience excited and engaged for years at a time, which was our goal, we would have to go back to sort of the first principles that Jon Roddenberry really was concerned about. His vision for the future, which is very optimistic and about human exploration and solving problems, sometimes with violence, because that happens with humans. I think he was both optimistic, but he also understood humans and the ways humans solve problems. So sometimes it's violence, but a lot of the time it isn't violence. It's through diplomacy or interesting technology, innovation, or whatever. So we really, really wanted to do that because we thought that would be true to Star Trek. So we spent time understanding that with Jon Roddenberry. We spent time really trying to understand, what was George R. R. Martin trying to accomplish with Game of Thrones, what was important to him, and then bring that to life in the narrative and the story and the experiences you have within the game. Mm-hmm. Because that's how you resonate with the audience, right? Yeah. The audience for Game of Thrones, it worked for a lot of reasons. It worked because it was a fantasy world that appealed equally to men and women. Like, it had a very broad demographic. It was because it drew upon things that had happened in history and kind of repurposed them within the world of Game of Thrones. People had a love-hate, but mostly a love relationship with how lethal the world was and how consequences, and even consequences for good actions, could sometimes result in things that were not good for the person who was doing the right thing. That was part of Game of Thrones. We recognized that, and we tried to bring that into the storytelling, similar to the way we tried to break down Star Trek. So, in the game industry, there's a pretty long history of IP-based games that haven't done that well, and that's because they just take some established game and they put the coat of paint of the IP on top of it, and
I expect it to work.
Yeah, and most of those games are just forgettable. Sometimes they work.
It's all the movie games. Yeah. You're like,
yeah, well, like anything in the game business, as I said, like sometimes it does work, and those are the exceptions. But the majority of the time, all that produces is forgettable games, or games that people really just want to forget because they don't deliver the experience of the world in a way that really connects with people. We built game designs where it was actually the design itself was built up from the storytelling themes, the narrative themes that were present in the IP, right? We weren't trying to retrofit some other game system design into the IP. And that's why we had to go through 5 iterations before we got it right, because, you know, the first few times we're like, this just isn't really capturing, say, what Star Trek feels like.
Mm-hmm.
And
Wow.
that's why you got to make sure your team has a lot of runway, and you've got to. Game business is all about shots on goal, right? You gotta be able to take a lot of shots, and that means just giving yourself the runway to experiment, learn from the audience, get feedback, try things. And I think perseverance can win the day a lot of the time in game development if you give yourself that opportunity.
I agree. This has all been amazing and great advice. But before we wrap it up, I do want to ask you about the metaverse and what that is and what's the future and vision for that. Because that's going to be epic if it's like a lot of games together and companies and all that stuff.
So I think of the metaverse as the next generation of the internet, but one that's much more geared towards creative expression. I think game development is one facet of the metaverse, right? There's going to be a lot of experiences in the metaverse. It's social experiences, musical experiences, even shopping experiences, things like that. So there's going to be all these different experiences that people are having. But ultimately, it's about really making it so creators who want to express themselves on the internet can do so, and do so without a lot of permission and a lot of technology constraints and a lot of the speed bumps that people have always run into in creating content on the internet. So the internet thus far has really been about having to be a technology specialist to bring things to market. And that's why you end up having to build so much stuff under the hood before you can even get to the part that your customer actually cares about. But that's been changing over the last few years. Like, you look at e-commerce, for example. It used to be that if you wanted to build an e-commerce website, you had to do all the stuff that Jeff Bezos did creating Amazon, right? So you're never going to catch up to that amount of investment. But fortunately, Shopify and a bunch of other companies have now created the stuff that if you want to put a store on the internet, you can do that. Game development was that way 10 years ago for the 3D graphics piece of things, right? Like, you really had to have graphics programmers and people that understood matrix math and could build all these things up from the more primitive APIs and elements to then build a game. And you had all kinds of game companies building their own 3D engines. You know, nowadays you use Unity or you use Unreal, and it's very packaged. You have a visual design environment. It gives you what you need to deliver the experience. So the metaverse is about having more and more things like that, where you're going to be able to have this whole range of activities. I think the idea of activities, experience, real-time interactions, that's really central to the idea of the metaverse. And then just letting people experiment and express themselves. And games are going to lead the way, because a lot of what we call the metaverse has been created by game companies, right? It's the graphic immersion, the social interactions. Like, game companies have been way ahead of this for a long time, but now we're going to expand it to a whole range of other experiences that people can have.
It's going to be wild. I can't wait for that moment when just games are all connected and like stores are connected and entertainment's connected, and you're starting to live like a Ready Player One type of world. No.
Well, I hope it's not exactly like Ready Player One, though, because so here's the problem with Ready Player One. The whole narrative premise, and I enjoyed reading the book, by the way. I was a Dungeons and Dragons. I've always been a Dungeons and Dragons player. I played D&D today with my kids in a campaign. So Tomb of Horrors,
Yeah.
Shout out to
Oh, I love that.
Ready Player One. Great. All the kind of stuff that he worked into there is awesome.
Genius.
Fan service for all of us who love all this stuff. But I don't like the vision of a company that sort of runs everything. So Oasis is like this huge monolithic platform run by one company, which is what the whole plot revolves around, is like the CEO left. I won't give a spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, but basically the CEO has left a legacy that people are then got to figure out and basically enjoy control of Oasis, right? And the wealth that it creates. I'm much more interested in the original ideas behind the internet, which is decentralization, open source, people in a permissionless manner being able to create what they want. Now, what slowed down the internet for many, many years is just how much technology expertise and building things up from individual tech components required, which favored the creation of a few really monolithic tech companies. So you've got Facebook and Google and whatnot, which, by the way, I don't object to any of these companies. I think they've done amazing things, but I don't want to live in their walled garden. And I would think that many, many game developers just want to control their own destiny, do their own thing, kind of hearkening back to not only early internet, but early PC game development, where you just make something and you can put it out there, and with enough determination and successful marketing and connecting with audiences and all this crazy stuff the game developers have to do, but not adding to it the idea of like getting someone's permission or giving them control over your destiny. So I don't want Oasis, right?
Same.
So I want an open metaverse where anybody can realize their creative dreams and execute on it. And I think we're going to get there, right? Because ultimately, it's going to be hard to make one monolithic environment that has all of the design tools and the audience and the graphics tech and the infrastructure. Like, there's so much stuff that the game industry needs. It's a couple $100 billion industry today. It's going to be hundreds of billions in the future. That's a lot of different games, a lot of different experiences. I just don't see one company owning all of that, or at least I hope that doesn't happen. And I hope we at Beamable are going to help bring people into a metaverse where they have that opportunity to build whatever they want and just run with it.
Mm-hmm. No, I like that. Be like Bitcoin, just someone make the metaverse and leave and disappear into the void. But yeah, this has been amazing. And so I want to do one last thing where you ask, give a challenge to the GameDev.tv listeners. We usually in our lectures have a challenge at the end. It could be anything related. But yeah, just give it a short, small challenge.
All right, well, I'll give you a challenge that's super relevant to what I do, which is build a live game, meaning a game that isn't just single player. Build something where other people are interacting. And give it a try. It's a lot easier to do these days than it used to be. And think about it, because you don't have to turn this into a game that is a worldwide success overnight, but learn what goes into that, because I think that live games with a live services component is going to be so critical to building a sustainable game that you can turn into a business for yourself in the future. So start understanding aspects of that, whether it's adding some social features, some multiplayer functionality, anything that involves multiple players within a game world.
Nice. It's a good challenge. And thank you for coming on. It's been so much fun, John. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been a blast. Yes. I love talking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. And I love that shirt again. Is there any way people can buy that?
There is. Yeah, actually, my wife runs a store, and she actually made this shirt and put it in there. So yeah, if anyone wants We Fight, a We Fight or an I Fight for the Game Maker shirt, I'll give you a link that you can pass on.
Awesome. I'll put that in the show notes. And then I just want to hand the mic to you to end it off, to do any last minute shout outs, tips and quotes, or anything you want to leave us off with. And thank you again for coming on, and the mic's all yours.
Yeah, just give yourself runway. Don't stop dreaming. Don't let any of the haters or the naysayers stop you from making the game you want. Like, you can do it. Persevere. Just give yourself the space to actually try stuff. I think that's how you're going to be successful.
Well, that's it. Thanks for listening. You can find all courses at GameDev.tv or in the show notes at a discounted price. Get started with the game development journey today.